My name is Karen During with the Virginia Institute of Marine Science at the Center for Coastal Resources Management, or CCRM. I'm the webinar host today. Assisting me as co-producer behind the scenes is Circe Gonzalez, the Coastal Training Coordinator with the Chesapeake Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. My CCRM colleague, Pam Mason, is also standing by as our shoreline policy expert to help answer questions and engage with today's discussion as needed. Welcome to part 2 of the 2020 Virginia Shoreline Management webinar series. This is the second of 3 webinars that we're hosting in place of the annual VIMS workshop that couldn't be held in person this year. The last webinar will be held next week, Tuesday, August 25th, featuring Living Shorelines performance. I'll tell you a little bit more about that last webinar at the end of this one. We're very excited to have over 100 participants registered for all 3 of the webinars in this series, representing a wide variety of shoreline agencies, coastal localities, and stakeholders from not only Virginia, but other coastal states as well. So everyone, welcome. Participant engagement during today's Zoom webinar will include a chat box and a Q&A feature. Use the chat box to send us comments and feedback if you need help. If you need help troubleshooting with anything, if you have maybe resources to share, website links or other information, or just to ask general questions. The Q&A feature is where you can post questions for today's webinar presenters. Click on the icons to open the chat and the Q&A. Hit enter after you type your messages to post them. You can enter questions and comments into the chat box and into Q&A anytime during the webinar. We have scheduled time built into the program to answer questions. And any unanswered questions that we don't have time to get to will be saved and we can address them later. For the record, CCRM archives the content from all of our annual tidal wetlands workshops on a dedicated website. This year's webinar series will be added to the workshop website, including links to the webinar recordings, presentations, questions and answers, related links, and other resources for each of the 3 topics. All of the registered participants will receive notification when the webinar series website is available to either share with others or for you to use for your future reference. And now I would like to introduce today's webinar topic and guest presenters. Earlier this year, the 2020 Virginia General Assembly passed amendments to 2 sections of the Code of Virginia that deal with tidal shoreline management: the Tidal Wetlands Act and the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act. Both pieces of legislation went into effect on July 1st of this year, after Governor Northam's approved the passage and signed them. I'm very pleased and honored to hopefully welcome Virginia's Secretary of Natural Resources, Matt Strickler, this morning, who is somebody we were waiting to see if he was able to join us yet. Can one of the panelists put into the chat box if the Secretary is here yet? If not, we can go ahead and start with our next guest speaker, but I'll tell you about all 4 of them. If the Secretary of Natural Resources was invited this morning to provide opening remarks about these recent amendments to Virginia's tidal shoreline legislation. But as some of you know, in Virginia, this is a busy week for the General Assembly. And then Skip Stiles with the nonprofit organization Wetlands Watch will provide an overview of why the shoreline legislation changes were needed to address changing shoreline conditions that we're all experiencing due to climate change, increased recurrent tidal flooding, and sea level rise. Then, representatives from Virginia's state agencies will summarize the amendments and related guidance updates to help local governments and the regulated public understand and successfully implement the new policies. First, Rachel Peabody with the Virginia Marine Resources Commission, or VMRC, will describe Senate Bill 776, amendments to the Tidal Wetlands Act, and updates to the wetlands guidelines that the wetlands boards follow. Then, Valent Lassiter with the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality, or DEQ, will discuss amendments to the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act, or CBPA. You might hear that acronym today. Plus a project that's underway to update guidance related to these amendments for allowable activities in resource protection areas. Both Rachel and Valent will tell us how everyone can participate in the public input process for updating the guidance for Virginia's tidal shoreline management. There will be several opportunities and workshops coming up in the future that they'll tell us about. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to start with Skip Stiles. Skip, if you are ready to turn on your video camera and you can start screen sharing, and then you can tell us about sort of the background of the legislation changes and why these changes were needed.
Okay, so you want to hand off to me and I'll...
If you just start sharing, you will override mine.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that.
Okay.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. There we go. So I'm going to provide sort of an overview of the background for these legislative changes. And for those of us who've been waiting for the resilience bus for a long time, this past legislative session was really pretty significant. There were a whole lot of legislative changes. The ones that we'll be talking about today are the ones that are bolded here: the Chesapeake Bay Act and the changes to the tidal wetlands guidelines. I'm also going to mention the flood fund that was set up and funded, remember that, and also some administrative changes that VDOT has made because they sort of play into this general discussion. So you can see there was a whole suite of new legislation that was passed. Why this year? The legislature changed leadership and there was a different direction in the legislative body. The administration, the Northam administration, had a resilience strategy that they wanted to implement. And so they found sponsors and encouraged others to put in legislation. But probably the most significant piece of this was the shift in the coastal flooding issue, well, in flooding generally, given all the floods we've had south side. It's become a constituent issue. It's no longer a partisan issue or an ideological issue. There are wet, angry people in everybody's district and they want solutions. And I think that the legislature has responded by saying, look, you know, I'm not going to worry about whether we call it recurrent flooding or sea level rise. Let's just start taking action. And I think that really broke down the last of the barriers. But the biggest piece of this is that all along the shoreline, you see evidence of the change. So this is ghost forests are all along the tidal shoreline, water coming in under mature trees and killing them. Those silver trunk trees are dead trees. This is right outside of Nassau, Langley, and Poquoson. In more urban areas, you see these kinds of things. Very healthy Spartina growing out of the curb of this road. And if you look at this road, it actually, the intertidal zone has crossed this road in Norfolk. It's Llewellyn Avenue. And you can see that you've got really a pretty standard tidal wetland profile here with the low marsh off by the lamppost and the high marsh with the rushes and reeds on the other side of the road, Phragmites behind it, and then the Iva or saltbush up at the high end. So when you go into end, you've got a stalled car because last night this road flooded, and that little yellow sign off to the left indicates how deep the water is, and I guess this fella didn't see it. So this is one of the things that we see in the urban areas is wetlands crossing roads and streets and just moving uphill. In rural areas, you see things like this. This is Bethel Beach in Matthews County. This was taken about 10 years ago. I have no idea what it looks like these days. But you can see that you've got a mature forest that's now a marine hazard sticking out in the water. And this shoreline is moving, I think Scott Hardaway says it moves upwards of 4 feet a year. So these are the kinds of things that we're dealing with. And then at the point you see a house. And this is one of the complicating factors, is there's a lot of property that is now being threatened by sea level rise. And these regulatory statutes have to take that into account. So we'll start with the Chesapeake Bay Act. Delegate Hope had a bill in that afforded, as one of the purposes of the Chesapeake Bay Act, afforded additional protection to mature trees in the Chesapeake Bay Act zone. And to that was added in the veto session an additional purpose of the act, that the Chesapeake Bay Act will look at coastal resilience and adaptation to sea level rise and climate change. And this is what's triggering the process to review the Chesapeake Bay Act that Valent will talk about in a little bit. And there is a rulemaking process that'll start. It's an expedited rulemaking process. And final action by the Water Quality Control Board will happen sometime into the future that Valent will talk about. The amendment, as I say, was added during the veto session, and it was meant to address an ongoing debate on how you change, or should you change, the Chesapeake Bay Act to deal with protections against properties like the one on that point in Matthews, basically allowing fill in the RPA to address encroachment from sea level rise. And this, as you will know, and as Valent well knows, creates a number of conflicts, because you've got people who want to protect their private property. You've got fill, putting fill on tree roots kills the trees, but you've got sea level rise that's moving the tidal wetlands uphill. You've got a statute that was designed to deal with the flow of water from the land into the water. Now you're dealing with you're trying to change the statute to deal with the water coming in the other direction up on the land. So it's a significant change in the sort of focus and intent of the Chesapeake Bay Act, and it's a very, very complicated process. It's interesting because the language included climate change, not just sea level rise, in the Chesapeake Bay Act. And I don't know to what extent other climate change impacts will be included, but with new rainfall intensity, it certainly is going to change non-point source pollution runoff calculations that need to be made. And so there's a whole host of other changes that may come into this because of this legislative change. The next change was a bill that Senator Lewis had in that had two pieces to it. The first was it changed living shorelines to the default approach for shoreline erosion control, unless best available science says it will not work. And therein lies the complications that Rachel and others will have to deal with. Essentially, when then Senator Northam made living shorelines the preferred method of shoreline erosion control, and a permit was issued by VMRC to expedite that process, the feeling was that we weren't moving fast enough on living shorelines, and so this statutory change was made. Tony Watkinson, VMRC, sent a letter around to each of the localities very early on, notifying them of these changes. But now the hard work is starting, trying to figure out what constitutes best available science that would have the local wetlands board either move in the direction of a living shoreline or not. The second piece of this is even more complicated. The second piece of the bill said that tidal wetlands permits will incorporate standards for sea level rise set by the Commonwealth, and from that will derive guidelines and minimum standards to address sea level rise. And so there's two pieces to this that are complicated. First, standards set by the Commonwealth. What is the state rate of sea level rise? We don't have one. Executive Order 45 has a sea level rise standard which uses the NOAA intermediate high curve, not intermediate curve, intermediate high curve. But it only applies to state agencies, institutions, and property, and not to the regulatory process. Executive Order 24 has the Chief Resilience Officer, Admiral Phillips, and the Special Assistant, Chief Resilience Officer, Matt Strickler, and the Special Assistant to the Governor, Ann Phillips, providing sea level rise estimates to local governments, but not state agencies. So The first thing that needs to be done is the state has to clearly state what is this rate of sea level rise that we'll be using for this, for the development of these guidelines and standards. And then the second piece of it then is, what do these guidelines and standards look like? And this is a much more complicated piece of work, because you've got to look at what anticipated impacts are going to be so that you can develop appropriate guidelines and standards. And the other piece of it is, there's a lot of discussion about guidelines. I don't know whether there's any work taking place to develop the standards that's mentioned in the statute. And I think that's probably something that we'll talk about later on. So you've got these two statutes. And what's interesting is it's the same landscape. Now this is the VIMS regulatory map that everyone sees. But if you look at within that circle, you've got the Chesapeake Bay Act and you've got the tidal wetlands, and it is essentially the same landscape. So for the first time, we're examining both of the statutes simultaneously by the same standards, sea level rise, climate change. And there's a real opportunity here to coordinate these statutes so that that one piece of landscape is not arbitrarily divided into the wetlands regulation going one way and the Chesapeake Bay Act regulations going another way. The other piece of this that I think is significant is this. So when you look back at that Matthews shoreline and you look at the transgression of the ecosystem that's occurred, excuse me, the rescission of the shoreline, you can see that the intertidal zone used to be the RPA. And so it, in the past, before this picture were taken, it would have been regulated by the Chesapeake Bay Act. So what you've got now is a dynamic aspect to the statute. It had been fixed. Here's the line. This is RPA. This is tidal wetlands. Now you've got a dynamic aspect to this statute, and it's going to trigger a whole set of, it should trigger a whole set of examinations of how you regulate in a changing environment like this. Very, very complicated. Let me move on real quick. Delegate Herring had a bill in that has the state join the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. It's an auction market for carbon credits. It generates income. That income will come back to the state. And when it comes back to the state, 50% of that money will go for the low-income energy efficiency programs at the state. The other half will go into the newly reconstituted Community Flood Preparedness Fund. That gets 45% of the funds. Early estimates are this could generate upwards of $100 million a year when it's at its peak. And that could mean as much as $45 million a year going into community flood preparedness. What does this fund look like? The fund will be administered by Department of Conservation and Recreation. Guidelines will be developed by DCR, Secretary Strickler, and the Special Assistant, Admiral Phillips. The fund is non-reverting. It hangs around till you spend it. It's separate from general fund, and it can be used at the state level for studies of state and regional significance. The fund is statewide. It's not just coastal. It now includes all of the riverine areas, which is going to be a challenge. Localities can use the fund for implementing flood protection in areas that flood. 25% of the fund is to be used in projects in low-income geographic areas, which is defined in the statute. Priority to projects that implement community scale hazard mitigation as opposed to the parcel by parcel work that we see from FEMA and other agencies. And nature-based solutions are emphasized. The other piece of this is that the fund can be used to provide loans to local governments to then give to property owners for individual parcel resilience work. And so there's both a grant and a loan piece to this. And this will kick off about spring of next year. Now, interestingly enough, to help move this forward, the Coastal Zone Management Program is helping the coastal PDCs develop capacity to compete for grant funding. This is a long-standing issue, increasing the capacity along our coastal PDCs to compete for NOAA funding and National Fish and Wildlife Foundation funding. But it's also going to help those localities develop the capacity to compete for this fund. The riverine communities do not have this, and in the work that we've done with those communities, there's a real challenge getting them ready to compete for this funding. The last piece, or administrative change, the Virginia Department of Transportation rewrote its engineering standards for, or design standards for the structure and bridge division, taking climate change impacts into account. This is very significant. We're looking around and we cannot find another state Department of Transportation that has taken these steps. So this is a big deal, and again, was done administratively without legislation. What's significant is they looked at a number of factors that may play into and help set standards for some of the other legislative changes that we'll be discussing in a minute. The temperature changes they looked at, they said would not change their current design standards. They're within the range of the current design standards. They looked at salinity, which is interesting because they, for the first time I've seen, someone is looking at if sea level rises, it's going to move the salinity boundary or the halocline upstream. And so VDOT did some work and figured that with the sea level rise projections we're looking at, and they used the NOAA intermediate high curve, the upstream boundary of the salinity of the halocline will move between 8.5 and 11 miles. So if they're designing a bridge in what is now tidal fresh, it's liable to be saline in over its life, and so they've got to design it for the salinity that's expected. They looked at increased precipitation intensity. They used essentially what Virginia Beach has been looking at, 20% increase in rainfall intensity. And so when they're designing the stormwater runoff at the ends of the bridges, they're now using much higher rainfall intensity estimates. And then they adopted the NOAA intermediate high curve, which is about 4 to 5 feet by the year 2100. So this is very significant as well. So that's sort of a quick run around where we've been. Again, lots of changes. I would point out that the DEQ mission had climate change added to it as well as environmental justice. But over time, I think you're going to see DEQ's operations change as this climate change gets written into updates on their programs and regulations. But anyway, these are this is the suite of measures that was passed back in January and April during the veto session. And again, we'll be discussing a couple of these coming up. So that's it. And in homage, Carl Hirschner, in memory of Carl Hirschner's continued presence, he always edited his slide with a picture of his dog, so I thought I'd throw a picture of my dog up. So I'd be happy to take any questions that are out there.
Thanks, Skip. Nobody's posted a question yet. You certainly covered a lot of ground, and Skip has a lot of experience with watching sea level rise and these changes that have occurred not only in our region but around the nation. He's often interviewed on national news about sea level rise, and Norfolk is in the spotlight as one of these areas that's experiencing this and trying to figure out how to deal with these challenges.
I have a question.
And I have a question in the Q&A box first, Pam, if you don't mind.
Yep.
When does VDOT publish this new guidance?
They're out already. Let me go find the URL and I will put it in the chat box. But they're out right now. we got a link to them on the blog post on our website. But when I get off, I'll go dig into and I'll post the URL in the chat box. So they're out now. Yeah.
Great, that's great, Skip. That's the kind of link that we'd like to share in the chat box for everybody to see. And if you are a participant and you want to share something like that, we can put it back out so that everybody can see it as well. Pam, did you have a question?
I think we're joined by the secretary, so I'll hold my question.
Okay. All right, Skip, if you want to turn your camera off and mute yourself, I will say welcome to Secretary Strickler, who has now joined us.
Hey, Karen, how are you doing today?
Good morning, Matt. Thank you so much for joining us today for this Shoreline Management webinar series. We just heard from Skip, who gave us an overview of all the different legislation that went through the General Assembly this year. And we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, thanks for that, and I apologize for being late. As you all know, special session's going on, and I had a semi-emergency phone call with the House Appropriations Committee about our budget items, so I had to get through that before I could join. And Skip, I apologize for jumping on top of your presentation here, so I'll be brief so you all can get back to the smart people. But again, thank you, Karen and Pam Mason. It's obviously good to be here with you, and I hope you're doing well. And I don't know if Kirk Havens is on or not, but the whole CCRM team is very special to me. As you all know, I'm an alum of VIMS and the CCRM lab, and I've got the flea bites from our infested trailers to prove it. Certainly enjoyed my time there though, and learned a ton from all of you, and of course from Carl Hirschner. And you know, it's been a really interesting time as Secretary of Natural Resources, and kind of a trip for me as somebody who was born and raised in Virginia, and having gone to VIMS and to William and Mary, and learned a lot about the Bay and the challenges that we have in Virginia's environment, and particularly with coastal resilience now, as you know, serving as the Chief Resilience Officer, and working with Admiral Phillips and a number of you and many others on trying to figure out what our strategy is going to be here in the Commonwealth to, you know, make our shorelines and coastal communities more resilient and adaptable to climate change. And you know, as you all know, we've highlighted in the past a lot of things that Governor Northam has done to start moving us in the right direction. You know, we issued Executive Order 24 right out of the gate to start the master plan development process, and a number of other processes and reports that have really been informative, I think, along the way, and trying to develop our resilience strategy and coordinate things like our you know, disaster mitigation programs and our dam and floodplain safety work and NFIP compliance and CRS and all of that kind of stuff together. There's just a lot to do, and you know, followed that up with Executive Order 45, which created the, you know, kind of first in the nation flood risk management standard that we're very proud of, and is a very strong state standard that we're for state building that we're going to apply more broadly to all state development, and also create guidance for localities to use as well, to adopt you know, standardized sea level rise planning curves, and also you know, base flood elevations, and the types of things that we would like to see kind of across the board for communities to all be on the same page to try to build in resilience and do a better job of preparing for what we all know is coming with sea level rise and increased storm surge from coastal hazards. So a lot of work to be done. As you all have been know, we are a little bit behind where we had hoped we would be in the master plan development process. You know, the work has been coming along. I think COVID is not an excuse, but certainly a factor in why we are where we are. But I'm actually going to be in the next couple of days sending down our kind of comprehensive master planning framework document for review, for executive review, and hopefully that's something we can have out on the street, you know, if not the end of next month, and certainly early fall, as something that we can start, you know, talking about publicly as the guide that we're going to use to, you know, to drive the master planning process. And we think that once we've got that out there, and have had the ability to, you know, to get around, whether physically or virtually, and talk to stakeholders in their communities, and particularly some of the underserved communities that you all know we have in Tidewater, Virginia. I think that'll really give us a good kind of launching point to really get cracking and do the really hard work of developing the master plan itself, which we see as, you know, a big part of that is identifying these specific projects, whether they're, you know, engineered solutions or green infrastructure solutions, or you know, strategic retreat solutions that we need to, you know, to focus on funding and supporting through policy to kind of implement our goals for making Virginia's coast more resilient. So, that's what we're working through now, and certainly appreciate everybody's involvement in that process. I know that a number of you have been really helpful to Admiral Phillips and to myself, and being a sounding board for ideas, reviewing materials and potential language for that planning document. And we're certainly going to continue to be a huge help as we get that out and try to move it forward. So again, appreciate your patience. And I think the biggest thing here is, I'm interested in hearing what you all have to say and taking questions from folks. And I'm certainly happy to hang as long as people want to chat with me about, what the governor's priorities are, what we see coming in the rest of his term and in this space, and just kind of have an open dialogue. So I'll stop there and see if folks have questions.
Thank you very much, Matt. And there's certainly no apologies necessary. We really appreciate everything that you and the others are doing in the General Assembly, not only during this special session, but all the time, working hard to help coastal communities deal with these realities. I'm looking at the question box. I don't see any new open questions for you just yet. If you're able to hang on, please do. We're going for another hour, but we're also recording the webinar. We're sharing all the questions in the chat comments, and we can certainly engage with you at a later date and provide you feedback. And we're posting all of this to a website, so there will be an opportunity for you to watch the other parts of the webinar recording or to see other information about not only this webinar, but the other two in the series, if you're not able to hang on with us for the rest of the session today.
Well, I'll hang as long as I can. And I actually did get one question through a personal message just now, which was, what do I see as the role for the local wetlands boards? And, it's a good question and an important one. And, the wetlands boards are critical because they, have kind of their finger on the pulse of what's going on in their communities, and are the, kind of the first line of review of project proposals, and are going to be a kind of a critical piece of implementing the work we need to do to make our communities more resilient. At the same time, we need them to step up, and we need them to, to kind of have more standardized and more kind of forward-looking approaches to the work that they do, and trying to protect our wetlands in the face of climate change. And that's, got to be a huge consideration. The biggest consideration is development proposals, and other proposals to alter wetlands are coming forward. And so you saw, as Skip has already given you an overview of, legislation that the governor proposed and the General Assembly adopted in the past session in 2020, that really charges VMRC and VIMS to come up with some more direct and updated guidance for the management and treatment of wetlands by the wetlands boards. And we think that's going to be really important, a really important component of all of our coastal resilience work going forward. And VMRC has already started the process of kind of coming up with an agenda for what it wants to do this fall as far as outreach to stakeholder groups, and having some webinars and taking some feedback, and as it moves towards developing those new guidelines. So I think that's a really exciting process, and hopefully one that'll be really helpful.
We do have a question now for you that sort of speaks to what our next speaker is going to discuss. I think we've got two questions. Can you talk a bit more about the path forward on implementation on SB 776? And the other question is, when is specific guidance going to be issued from VMRC for implementation of SB 776? And these are both questions that our next speaker, Rachel Peabody, is planning to address. So I have another question for the secretary, just one more question. How do we ensure that all the good work you and your staff have done persists in future administrations?
Sure. So that's a question that we've been thinking through as well. I think we are one of the outcomes of the master planning process and getting this framework out is going to be kind of a suite of legislative proposals. And I think one of the things we really want to try to do during the governor's last session is lock in some of the progress that we've made and get that solidified in code. And so that's going to be the biggest thing, and certainly we'll be working with you all and other interested folks to generate support for that. And again, you'll see more from us on that soon when we get the master planning framework document out in the coming weeks. But that's the biggest thing, and then just use the tools that we have and the the new authorities and kind of direction that the governor's given under the executive orders to show how we can make resilience work. And once we're doing that and we've got proof of concept, then I think that will kind of perpetuate itself to some extent, and in combination with locking some of this stuff that's only administrative now into law. That's the combination we need.
Great. Thank you so much for being here today, Secretary Strickler. We really appreciate it. And now to find out more about the details of the implementation and the new guidance for both of these acts, let's turn now to our next speaker. So Matt, if you want to hang on, you can turn off your camera and mute yourself, but please listen in if you can.
All right,
and
thanks,
there may be
Karen.
more questions that come in, and if you can't, again, thank you very, very much.
Okay,
so
thank you.
Rachel Peabody, if are you ready? Rachel does not have video camera today, so she's just going to speak with us while she shares her screen to show us some slides and talk about Senate Bill 776, amendments to the Tidal Wetlands Act, and the process of updating the wetlands guidelines. Thank you for being here today, Rachel. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. That question was a perfect lead into my presentation. So if I don't cover specific things through this presentation, I'm happy to answer questions. But to start with introducing myself, I'm Rachel Peabody. I am an environmental engineer at the VMRC in our Habitat Management Division. I'm a permit writer. I stick mostly to Norfolk, Portsmouth, and Suffolk, but cover the south side of the James River as well. And I've been given the task of getting VMRC started in updating our guidelines. And so as such, I'm going to cover a little bit of the 2020 updates, as well as our process for updating the guidelines. So my discussion today is specifically for the jurisdiction of tidal wetlands. Just to cover that, tidal wetlands are managed by the local wetlands boards through the Wetlands Act and have oversight by the VMRC. And really, to understand the 2020 legislation, I wanted to discuss a little bit about the 2011 legislation, which was really where living shorelines became codified as the preferred shoreline stabilization methods in tidal wetlands. And so in 2011, living shorelines were defined and placed in code. They were also established as the preferred method for shoreline stabilization. And in 2011, that legislation requested that VIMS conduct a study of tidal shoreline management in Virginia and to recommend methods to streamline regulations, encourage living shoreline methods, and to provide recommendations for sustained protection of tidal shoreline resources. That process resulted in the VMRC and VIMS and a number of other stakeholders and agencies creating two general permits. The general permit for living shorelines, General Permit 1, which is a softer approach for low fetch shorelines, and General Permit 2, which has a little bit of a higher fetch and requires a bit more stabilization. So the legislation in 2020 was really to build off of those 2011 concepts to give it some more teeth. And instead of living shorelines being the preferred alternative, they are now the default approach to shoreline control. And the code says there, the default, unless best available science indicates that a site is not suitable for such methods. Best available science is going to be the new goal of how we can communicate best available science with the public and local wetlands boards, and that's going to come in our guidelines. There are a few other details within the 2020 legislation. It requires that all wetlands applications include a statement specifically if a living shoreline is not being proposed on why it's not suitable, including reasons for that determination. And those reasons should be using the best available science. So the 2020 legislation also tasked the VMRC to update our tidal wetlands guidelines. Our guidelines were last updated in 1993, and they really are still pertinent. The concepts within the guidelines are pertinent, but they were written before living shorelines were defined by code, or I wasn't around, but I would assume before it was a really popular definition. So there's 4 things that the code is asking the VMRC to include, actually 5 things. I'll cover the 5th after. But the first one is the guidelines need to communicate to stakeholders and regulatory authorities that living shorelines are the preferred stabilization method. It asks that we identify preferred shoreline management approaches, so best management approaches for shoreline types, and then explain the risks and benefits for those protection types. And then the 4th is the guidelines should recommend procedures to achieve efficiency and effectiveness by the various regulatory entities. And this is, at least in my view, this is really where we start talking about how can we better manage the shoreline zone as a whole. So there's going to be a lot of structures who are going to need to go within the Wetlands Board and the CBPA, and how can we keep the same concepts fluid through those 2 jurisdictions. And then the 5th part, which Skip covered really well, is that wetlands permits shall now ensure protection of shorelines and sensitive coastal habitats from sea level rise and coastal hazards, and then states specifically that we should consider the guidelines and minimum standards promulgated by the Commission pursuant to a subsection. So the 5th portion of the guidelines that we are going to need to include is that portion of sea level rise and coastal hazards. So this is a big project that is important that we complete. Again, it's been since 1993 since we've updated our guidelines. And so we're trying to bite this off in several ways. We've started a specific working group with VIMS within VIMS leadership to start giving us recommendations of what is the best available science, redefining wetlands, things of that sort, and they're going to continue to give us comments. But also, we really want to hear what our stakeholders have to say. What is it that our stakeholders need from us? How do they want us to communicate that to them? And specifically local wetlands boards. Do they want us to be very specific or just give them the direction of where to find the best available science? So we have established 4 guidelines workshops. The first one is next Wednesday. And next Wednesday is specifically focused on the VMRC listening to the local wetlands boards. Tell us what you need us to hear, what you need us to include. And because of our current situation with COVID, although we wanted to do these things in person, we're going to manage them through WebEx panel. So each section, each work group will have about 5 to 7 panelists that will help lead the conversation. But please know that these guidelines workshops are open to anybody. We want to hear what people have to say. And so as we move through the agenda, as the panelists finish their portions of the discussion, we will open up to the public and hear your thoughts and concepts. In addition, if you're unable to attend any of our workshops or would just like to throw comments at us, we have a email set up specifically for that, which is wetlandsguidelines@mrc.virginia.gov. You can find this information on VMRC's website under agenda and get the information for logging in. And so I wanted to finish my presentation with just a little bit of review of some of the data we have available to us in joint permit applications that we have received. And if any of that has been changed, if the requests for shoreline stabilization have changed over time since the 2011 legislation. So just a quick overview here, we have Riprap applications in red, bulkhead in black, and living shorelines in yellow. And this is based off of the total miles per year that was applied for. This is not particularly permitted, but this just gives us a good understanding of people's value of living shorelines. So we're seeing that riprap revetment is the largest request over time. It dipped a little bit in 2015 and 16. But we have seen a change in living shorelines versus bulkheads. So 2012, we saw almost 2 more miles of bulkheads being requested than living shorelines. And over time, those living shorelines have grown. And I think this is going to be a good way in the future for us to kind of see, are we changing the hearts and minds of homeowners and contractors to see what kind of requests are actually coming in. A different way to look at this is, here's a table that just shows the total miles of applications of each type of shoreline structure from July 1 of 2011 to August 10th of 2020. So we've had a total of 49 miles of bulkhead, which is approximately 27% of the applications, almost 80 miles of riprap, which is 44%, and 54 miles of living shorelines. So bulkheads and living shorelines are staying head to head with riprap, consistently being applied for. And that is the end of my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Rachel. We do have some questions. Let's see, I'll start with one of the questions that I've already been asked several times as well, is whose available science will be accepted?
That's a really good question.
Right up there first off.
Yeah. So that is what we are going to try and define in the guidelines. And at least, so best available science is going to change over time. And the point and the hope is that the guidelines are going to be flexible enough that it will point the user in the direction of best available. But the guidelines themselves can stay stable over time. So currently, if you are a permit decision maker, the current guidelines, in my opinion, are still very relevant to look at when making permit decisions. But in addition, the CCRM and VIMS website has a number of tools to help get users in the right direction. So there's the mapping tool, there's the new guidance that has come out. So I want to point people in that direction for best available science, and just know that we are working on trying to clarify that in the guidelines.
Okay, thank you. Another question is related to that one, is what type of documentation and who will sign off if a living shoreline will not work? So I think that what they're asking is sort of what kind of evidence or proof needs to be provided to make that determination.
Yeah. So that is where, this is where the wetlands boards get to, I guess, flex their brains. So it is up to the wetlands boards to determine whether the applicant has given enough proof or evidence that a living shoreline is suitable or not suitable based off of the tools that we have now. So like I said, there's a lot of tools here. And the wetlands boards have a number of things to weigh in that process. And so it's really up for the wetlands boards to weigh all of the tools that they have currently, and to really discuss that on the record. And then, of course, VMRC is here to help. Virginia Institute of Marine Science, through the advisory program, can do site-specific determinations and also write individual reviews of a particular project. And then in the long run, VMRC still has oversight. And so if we feel like a decision is going in a direction where we feel like the evidence does not support the decision, then we'll most likely ask the commission to review it.
And here's another question for you, Rachel. We'll take one more for Rachel before we have to move on to the next presenter. But this is probably a question that also maybe can't be answered yet until the new guidance is finished. But how would a bulkhead or rock revetment being replaced in kind be handled under this new guidance? I assume this means replacement structures, replacing exactly the same kind of structure that's already there.
Yeah, that is a great question, and one that I've asked as well, that I think we need to answer in the guidelines. And that is particularly something that I would like to discuss in these workshops, and just get feedback from people on the way that they would like this to be evaluated and written in the guidelines. These are the types of questions I really want to hear for these workshops, because we may not be able to give an answer for every single one, but the goal is to give you at least the questions to get you to the answers in that process. So far, I don't have an answer for that, and I'm hoping the guidelines will eventually lead you in that direction.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And I think everybody now better understands what the process is going to be, and that there's going to be opportunities for everybody to provide comments if you choose to, in a variety of ways. You can participate in the workshops that VMRC has scheduled. We've provided some links for you to find more information about those meetings, as well as the email address that you can send comments to. That there is open anytime. So, and you can always, I'm sure, contact or mail letters and other information to VMRC to get on the record what your questions and comments and concerns and suggestions are, as all part of the public input process. And now, in a related topic, and I know of great interest to some of the local government staff here today, is to hear from Valent Lassiter about a similar effort that's underway for the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act. So Valent, if you're ready to turn on your video camera and start sharing your screen, you should be able to.
There's my camera.
There you are. We can hear you as well. And if you want to start sharing your screen.
I will try. Yes.
We will then hear about the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act amendments and guidance.
Does everybody see my screen?
It's coming. It says that you've started screen sharing. So we will, there it is. Okay. So now you can go into slideshow mode.
Oh, I'm not there?
Not yet.
I think there's a lag on my computer.
I think you click resume slideshow. There you go. There it is. Perfect.
All right. Yeah, there seems to be a lag on my computer.
It's all
anyway,
good now, and you can take it from here.
Okay, good morning and welcome to my home. My name is Valent Lassiter, and I am a Principal Environmental Planner with DEQ's Office of Watershed and Local Government Assistance Programs. I am the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act Liaison to the Middle Peninsula and Northern Neck localities in Virginia. And today, I'm here to discuss the recent passage of House Bill 504 by the Virginia General Assembly, which, as Skip and Rachel had mentioned, which HB 504 added coastal resilience and adaptation to sea level rise and climate change to the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act performance criteria requirements. And as has also already been mentioned, the passage of House Bill 504 will require amendments to the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act. But first, we have a really wide audience on this webinar. And so for those of you who may not be familiar with the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act, I'm going to do a really quick overview. The Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act is a state local cooperative program. It's implemented by localities through the incorporation of performance standards in local ordinances and comprehensive plan policies. And this is established in the very first section of the Act. And the overall goal is to prevent and reduce non-point source pollution with a comprehensive approach to the protection of water quality through sound land use and development practices. And this is primarily accomplished by the protection of sensitive lands. And our office, the Office of Local Government Programs at DEQ, provides oversight and technical assistance to localities, such as regulatory interpretations, site plan review, and training. Excuse me. However, we don't have any authority to override local government land use determinations. A lot of people think we do, but we don't. But we do monitor their programs through periodic compliance reviews, and we can ultimately find localities non-compliant if they have a pattern of making bad decisions. And I think it's also important to note that the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act was adopted in 1988, long before climate change and recurrent coastal flooding became the serious issues that they are now. Okay, this map shows Virginia's portion of the Chesapeake Bay watershed, which is the area in green, and the CBPA applies to the localities shown to the right of the red line and basically covers the counties, cities, and incorporated towns east of I-95. And these, of course, are also the localities in Virginia most susceptible to recurrent coastal flooding. And the insert at the top just provides a more detailed view of these localities. Okay, these are the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Area land types that the Act and regulations regulate and attempt to preserve. And the Resource Protection Area, or RPA, includes the most environmentally sensitive features of a locality's Chesapeake Bay Preservation Area, and it also has the most restrictive performance and development criteria. RPAs include tidal wetlands and shores, non-tidal wetlands connected and contiguous to water bodies with perennial flow, and a 100-foot buffer area landward of those features that I just mentioned. RMAs, or resource management areas, are typically adjacent to RPAs, and development within the RMA is less restrictive. Any use allowed by the underlying zoning is permitted, as long as it complies with the general performance criteria found in our regulation. RMAs typically include floodplains, highly erodible soils, including steep slopes, highly permeable soils, and non-tidal wetlands not included in the RPA. And RMA areas can range in localities from jurisdiction-wide to feature-based to a minimum linear distance contiguous to the RPA. So localities have the authority to designate resource management areas as they wish, to some degree. But for the purposes of today's discussion, we're going to focus on the RPA. Okay. During the 2020 session of the Virginia General Assembly, HB 504 was passed, which amended the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act to specifically require the preservation of mature trees or planting of trees as a water quality protection tool and as a means of providing other natural resource benefits, and the promotion of coastal resilience and adaptation to sea level rise and climate change. The Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act regulations are going to have to be amended to reflect these new requirements, and we at DEQ are currently meeting individually with stakeholders to gain their technical expertise and input into the development of these regulatory amendments. There will also be future opportunity for engagement down the road, including formal notice and comment on the proposed regulation before adoption by the State Water Control Board. Even though I live and work in Richmond, I've seen firsthand the effects of recurrent coastal flooding and the need to address coastal resilience when I went on a field trip organized by the Middle Peninsula Planning District Commission to the Middle Peninsula region last October. And this field trip was to view the effects of what is known as sunny day flooding, or the soggy sock syndrome, as many Middle Penn locals call it, which describes the wet lawns that many property owners are experiencing due to sea level rise and the natural progression of wetlands. And this is a photo taken from that field trip. And you can see to the right of the slide, the standing water approaching the house and the bright blue sky above, and those poor wetlands trying to migrate. Some property owners have been taking it upon themselves to fill these wet areas without local approval, which is in direct violation of the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act. This is another photo from that trip. And this is coming back from Guinea Neck in Gloucester County. And when we'd gone down that road, about 45 minutes prior to this photo being taken, there was no standing water. It was completely dry. We were visiting a site at the point of Guinea Neck, and the tide came in as we were leaving, leaving that site, and the conditions deteriorated really, really quickly. Most of us on that field trip were in a minibus, but VIMS, very own Mark Luckenbach, was following us in this car, and I took this photo. I was really worried he was going to get swept off the road. The water, it rose really, really fast, and it got pretty deep. This photo actually doesn't totally do it justice. But anyway, meanwhile, while HB House Bill 504 was going through its process in the General Assembly, we at DEQ, the Office of Local Government Assistance Programs, had applied for and were awarded a 2020 NOAA Project of Special Merit grant through the Virginia Coastal Zone Management Program. And this grant provides funding for us to develop a guidance document for Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act localities that are experiencing recurrent coastal flooding from climate change and sea level rise. And this document will focus on integrating practices, techniques, and policies that build resiliency against sea level rise and recurrent flooding into existing elements of the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act and regulations. And it will also focus on actions that property owners can take to protect shorelines from recurrent flooding and this is important, and that are compliant with the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act. And we, DEQ, we're collaborating with the Virginia Coastal Policy Center and VIMS in the development of this guidance document. And once again, relevant stakeholders will be engaged during this process. Some of the practices that have been brought up for consideration so far include conservation landscaping. And conservation landscaping involves the conversion of areas of managed turf or bare soil into perennial meadows using native species. This is a definition used by the Chesapeake Bay Program's Urban Stormwater Work Group and the Virginia Conservation Assistance Program, otherwise known as VCAP. And this photo is from VCAP's website, must give them credit. This BMP can work really well on steep slopes and creates a much more diverse landscape in areas that were once bare soil or turf grass. Deep-rooted native grasses and shrubs and trees obviously have much more ability to absorb water than turf grass, and robust riparian vegetation can reduce the magnitude and frequency of periodic storm and flood surges. And conservation landscaping would be considered a permitted modification of the resource protection area buffer and could be approved administratively by a local government. This BMP does not create a conflict with the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act. Living shorelines, we've talked about these a little bit already. Living shorelines are basically, in a nutshell, shoreline protection that incorporates as many natural elements as possible into its design. And unlike bulkheads or riprap, which cut off the connection between land and water, living shorelines provide a transition zone that grows over time. And they provide excellent wildlife habitat and natural resilience to waterfront properties. However, the installation of living shorelines can create conflicts with the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act, which requires the retention of riparian buffers. And often, in order to create a living shoreline, it may require land disturbance and the removal of buffer vegetation, including mature trees in the RPA. But even so, living shorelines are considered to be a shoreline erosion control structure and are a permitted modification of the RPA buffer area under the regulations. They can be approved administratively by local government. Filling in the RPA. Filling in the RPA involves the placement of fill material to elevate the property and absorb excess water. This has been proposed as a short-term solution to give property owners a chance to prepare for longer-term solutions, such as, and a longer-term solution would be like retreat from coastal areas, or the elevation of structures. And this is a photo of a property that had been filled, that was taken during my Middle Peninsula field trip. But as you can see, in actuality, all it really seems to do is displace the water. If you look towards the far background of the slide, you can see it's just encroaching on the neighbor's property. Filling in the RPA is not a permitted activity under the regulations, and to do so, a property owner must go through the formal exception process, including a public hearing before the locally designated review body. So what is our timeline and where are we now? We are actually really just getting started. The regulatory amendments to the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act will be made through an expedited regulatory process that doesn't require a regulatory advisory panel or a notice of intended regulatory action. The hope is to have the amendments developed by the end of this year and adopted by the State Water Control Board at the spring 2021 meeting, with the amendments going into effect the following fall. And for the development of the guidance document, the project period runs October 1st, 2020 through March 31st, 2022. So it's about a year and a half we have to develop this guidance document and engage our stakeholders and whatnot. And at this point, you know, as I said, the project starts October 1st. So right now, we are currently developing specific work plans for the Virginia Coastal Policy Center and VIMS to undertake the project deliverables. And that's all I have. Does anyone have questions?
Yes, we do have some questions for you, Valent.
Very good.
I think your last couple of slides answered some of the questions that came in about the timeline, about when the Water Control Board was going to issue the new regs. So I think that question was answered with hopefully spring of next year, correct?
Yes.
And then another question was, how do we get a list of the local government liaison assignments? The list on the DEQ website is from 2017. So I assume that there might be a more up-to-date version since then. Not the questioners asking that. They assume that there might be a more up-to-date version since then?
There is. And if you contact me, I can get it to you directly, and I will make note that the list on our website is outdated, because we definitely have added a new liaison, Amber Foster. I think she's on this call. Now she's replaced Rachel Ham. So 2017 is definitely outdated. I will try to get the one on our website updated, but anybody who needs a list can contact me directly. I do have one.
So you can see her contact information there. So anybody who has questions about that or anything can reach out to Valent, and I'm sure she'd be happy to answer your questions directly. Another question for you, Valent, is why did DEQ decide to use an expedited regulatory process?
That is just the way the bill was written. I've actually asked my boss that very question yesterday because I was unsure how to answer it if I got it. And he said, that's the way the bill was written. And that's all I know about it.
Another question is, when would localities have to update their local ordinance? Will it be after the guidance?
Ooh, good question. That has not been determined yet, but, you know, I would take a guess, and this may not, you know, be what my supervisor, Justin Williams, would say, but probably during round 3 of our compliance evaluations. We're currently reaching the end of round 2 of our compliance evaluations, our local government compliance evaluations now. I would suspect during round 3, we're going to make sure that everybody's got their ordinances fully updated. Of course, I'm sure any locality that wanted to do it before then could, and we would assist them. But during round 3 is when I suspect that we will make sure that they are all updated.
Another question for you, Valent, is also a frequently asked question that we receive at CCRM, is how are septic systems in the RPA and RMA being addressed?
being addressed. Is that what you said?
Yes.
At this point, there's no new regulatory language proposed, so business as usual. But during some of the conversations we've had with stakeholders thus far, not that we've had all that many, but as I said, we're just starting this process. I mean, it has been brought up, and this is something that will need to be addressed probably through the development of the guidance document, more so than the regulatory amendments. But very often, septic systems that once were outside of an RPA due to sea level rise and erosion and other factors, in a few years end up being within an RPA, and a few more years down the line could be underwater with the rate of sea level rise that we're seeing. So this is something that we're going to have to figure out through the guidance, I suppose.
So, Karen, may I add something here?
Sure, Pam.
To that point. And thank you, Valent. Great presentation. So one of the things that's going on right now at CCRM VIMS is a lot of research and mapping for water supply, so shallow groundwater wells and septic systems, and the likelihood of risk to those systems based on certain projected sea level rise curves. So that information partly has been, sort of our first prototype effort has just been completed, and we are continuing to work on that. So I expect that type of information will also become folded into the considerations made about what to do with groundwater wells and septic systems.
Thank you for that
Yes,
clarification and that information, Pam, about that research. I have another question for you, Valent, one more, and then we're going to open it back up because there's several questions to go back to. Rachel and possibly Skip may be able to address some of these as well. But for you, Valent, what is the frequency of DEQ compliance reviews for the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act? You mentioned, you sort of alluded to that, and how are sites selected and where are the findings posted?
I don't think the findings are posted. Well, they're not posted on our website. Of course, it's public information. They're available through your liaison, through the liaison who would be the person assigned to the particular locality that you were interested in. But compliance evaluations are supposed to occur under our regulation on a 5-year cycle. This, of course, was when the Chesapeake Bay Local Assistance Department used to be its very own department with 33 employees. We are down to 5 now. So, I mean, compliance evaluations are not happening every 5 years like they should. We're doing them as quickly as we can, but we often get pulled onto other initiatives as well. When the stormwater regs rolled out, the Chesapeake Bay Preservation liaisons were assigned to help localities with this new stormwater regulation. And then of course, with WIP 3, we're sometimes pulled into those duties. So a short answer, they're supposed to be done every 5 years, but in actuality, they rarely are. Did I answer that completely? Was there a third part?
Yes, you did. That's perfect. So now we have about 10 minutes where we can go back to some of the questions that are related to Senate Bill 776 and the living shorelines and other things. So if I could ask Rachel to unmute yourself, because I think you're going to need to answer a couple of these questions.
Yep, I'm here.
That was excellent, Valent. That was very informative, and I think all the participants will hopefully now have a much better idea about the new legislation at both the Tidal Wetlands Act and the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act. And what we heard from Skip is how these are connected systems in the landscape, and managing them as separate jurisdictional areas is very challenging. And we know this for the local governments. And so we hope that these opportunities to provide public comment, please let these agencies know what your thoughts are. But here's a couple questions going back to you, Rachel, about living shorelines. And I'm going to try to combine a couple, 2 or 3 questions are all related to the same thing. And that's the frequently asked question about cost.
Yeah.
Will the costs of projects be considered in determining the correct shoreline erosion control structure?
So my initial answer is that we definitely need to address this in the guidelines, and to say that we can ignore cost, I don't think is fair to anybody. So the goals of the guidelines will be to perhaps define when is cost a relevant answer for not a living shoreline and when isn't. And that's something I really want to talk about next week at our workshops is how do people want to put that metric on cost? So the goal is not to ignore it, because we can't. Cost is important to everybody. And it is the wetlands boards to balance all of those things. That's what the code tells us to do, is to balance wetland development and necessary economic development. So it will be in there. I don't know how it's going to be in there, and I am happy to take ideas on that.
Good. Another question related to living shorelines, this concept of the new requirement is once a shoreline stabilization system is in place, which is not a living shoreline, is it the wetlands board's responsibility to inspect that system or structure? If not, is there a responsibility of another group? And I think if any structure is anything that's permitted along the shoreline by the wetlands board remains a responsibility of the local government for inspection and compliance. Is that correct, Rachel?
That is correct. There's probably a number of other regulatory agencies that are also looking at it. So building permits, so locality building inspectors probably look at it. The VMRC has a random compliance check. So we choose a random amount of wetlands projects to go evaluate as well. But yes, if there is a permit associated with that project, it is up for the wetlands board to ensure that it complies with the permit.
And another one for you, Rachel, while we sort of have you.
Yeah.
To VMRC, it would be very helpful if a new model ordinance about all this could be provided to wetlands boards and boards of supervisors. Is that something that might happen? Is that something that you envision might come out of the process of the guidelines? Would that include templates like a model ordinance?
So that's where the CBPA and the Wetlands Act is considerably different. So the Wetlands Act, which is Chapter 13, is the model ordinance. And so I can provide a link to that chapter, and that is specifically what the board is held to legally for when they're reviewing wetlands board's permits. So we can't change the Wetlands Act. But so basically the boards and the localities can either choose to copy and paste it every time it gets updated, or just to reference it in their ordinances to reference back to Chapter 13.
Okay.
But the guidelines are supposed to fill in the blanks of how to administer the Wetlands Act. And so that's really what the guidelines are supposed to do, is to lead us in the direction of how we can better administer the Wetlands Act.
And to any and all wetlands board members and wetlands board staff out there, this is certainly something that we can continue to track and monitor and help share information across localities. What are you all trying to do so that you don't each have to reinvent this yourselves, but that you have the opportunity to know what other localities are doing. So I have a question for you, Valent. Is DEQ reaching out to stakeholders, localities, the PDCs about these changes now?
Currently, we are reaching out not so much to localities, but to PDCs for sure. Other state agencies, we've met with virtually, of course, met with about 5 to 6 other state agencies. We are now currently reaching out to PDCs and non-government organizations. That's our next level. And the PDCs, I think, ultimately will be responsible for reaching out to the localities and going to the level below the PDC level. Still to be determined to some degree, but that's the plan for now.
Another question for you, Valent, but it also sort of speaks to all of us. This is a question that I've been asking myself for 20 years of working here in Virginia. How can we introduce new BMPs that permit living shorelines to transition upslope into the adjacent CBPA areas? You know, this is something I've always encouraged, that living shoreline designs should not only include the intertidal zone, but the riparian buffer zone as well. But it does require crossing these jurisdictional boundaries. So as far as new BMPs are concerned, is it, and you said that living shorelines are already allowed by the CBPA to occur, and that the local governments can approve those administratively. Does that include projects that straddle both the wetland area under the Wetlands Board's jurisdiction and the RPA zone that's under the local government staff or CBPA board's jurisdiction?
Well, you know, I think in most cases, living shorelines would straddle both jurisdictions. And so I guess what we're going to be addressing and figuring out during the guidance development process is weighing the benefits of retaining a riparian buffer or creating a situation in which a shoreline can migrate. These are the kind of questions we're going to be wrestling with that we don't have the answers to yet, but that's the whole intention of this effort, was to get these programs working like this instead of this.
And here's a related question for either Rachel or Valent, and another one that I get often is the transition along the shoreline. What can be done to create continuity where shoreline stabilization is occurring between properties with living shorelines or natural shorelines? So this idea of how do we achieve continuity across parcel ownership?
Right, where some owners are hardening their shorelines and others are implementing living shorelines. You know, education, I think, is really, I mean, our only hope. I mean, there's no regulatory authority. Well, besides the 776, which does require, from this point forward, that living shorelines will be considered, and if they are feasible, they must be used. But so that's going to help a lot. But I think education is a huge component, and also the Living Shoreline Revolving Grant Program probably needs to be publicized a little bit better. That helps property owners, you know, with the costs incurred.
Yeah, I agree. You know, there's a little bit of a carrot and there's a little bit of a stick when it comes to incorporating living shorelines. And, you know, SSB 776 is intended to be the stick, but having more funding, education for contractors, for homeowners, NGOs, those are going to be the carrots that can really, you know, help us along in the process.
And another question for Valent that might be best answered directly. I don't know if you have this readily available off the top of your head, but can you provide the specific language that requires an expedited process for the regulatory amendments or new regs?
Yeah, I don't have that, but I can probably get that from my boss if you shoot me an email directly, and I will talk to Justin because he knows a lot more about the process than I do. I'm kind of observing from the sidelines and as a note taker scribe type person, but he knows a lot more about it, and I can definitely get you more information from him.
All right, great. Skip, was there anything else you wanted to add? We have a few more minutes. If there was anything you wanted to add as a closing remark before I do our final wrap up.
No, not really. Just
Okay.
really cool stuff and really complicated. I don't envy Rachel or Valent or anyone trying to fill these pieces together, but I think it's important that we all participate and help with it, because as I said, we can't find any place in the country that's doing what these statutes are asking our state to do.
Rachel, did you have any last words?
No, other than keep the questions and the comments coming, because this is going to be our shot to build some helpful guidelines. And we're here to listen, and I really want to make a document that is helpful. So please throw your comments at us.
Valent, one last thing.
Pretty much the same. Looking forward to the process. I'm encouraged and happy about these regulatory changes, and I think they're definitely the right step forward. And let's all work together to get it done.
Thank you so much, presenters. I do have a few wrap-up comments to share with the everybody on the webinar. As I said, we are recording this webinar. We're saving all of the chat comments and all of the questions and answers. So if your question did not get answered today, we will try to formulate either a verbatim transcript or some kind of summary of everything that was recorded today. If for more information about shoreline laws and policies, I encourage everyone to check out the new Shoreline Management Handbook that's now available at the CCRM website. This was featured during last week's webinar. And the link is here. And also I'd be happy to help you find that. Our CCRM website, as I said at the beginning, has many tools and information to support tidal shoreline management and decision-making, including this new handbook. And we're happy to help you find anything that you need. Feedback is welcome about today's webinar, about the webinar series, about any of the tools or information on our website, or anything you've heard about us. There are several ways you can let us know what we can do to improve our work for you and our advisory service for shoreline management. You can enter a chat box message in the few minutes that we have left today, and that will be captured. We're going to be sending out a post-webinar evaluation survey. We're waiting until after next Tuesday's webinar to send one survey to everybody who registered for all three, because we know a lot of you signed up for all three and we didn't want to send you the same survey 3 times. So we will be sending out an easy, quick survey that will give you another opportunity to provide us feedback, positive and negative. And then you can also send us an email. We have an email address that you can send questions, comments, any kind of feedback to us at ccrminfo@vims.edu. That's V as in violin, M as in Mary, S.edu. And we encourage you to visit our website. I want to thank all of today's webinar presenters again. There was an excellent program. And thank you for your patience. So the program changes. We were very happy that the secretary was able to join us during a very busy week in Richmond. Special thanks to Circe Gonzalez for her role as producer behind the scenes, and my colleague Pam Mason for joining to help guide the conversation today. And certainly thanks to all of the participants who joined today as well. We hope you come back next week, Tuesday, August 25th, same time, 10 to 11:30 a.m. for the last in our series webinar about living shorelines performance. My VIMS colleague and scientists, Scott Hardaway and Pam Mason again, will talk about projects they've been working on related to the monitoring and analysis of living shorelines. Scott's going to share research results with us of projects that he designed and installed and has been monitoring their performance over time to see how resilient these projects have been. He's also going to talk about the shoreline evolution data they've been producing, looking at evolution trends. They've been updated through 2017 now from 2009 for a lot of localities. So he's going to share that data and where we can find it. And then Pam is going to tell us about a project that looked at what kind of water quality and TMDL credits could be achieved if more living shoreline projects with vegetation are installed throughout our landscapes. So I encourage everybody to tune back in on next Tuesday. Registration is still open. You're welcome to share information about the webinar series, either next week's or the past 2 webinars. As I said, there will be a webinar website where you can find all the information from all of the series. So it's 11:30. Goodbye for now. Stay well, everyone, and have a great day.